And here we are in week 8 of our 9-week series on Mennonites writing in Canada, mostly during the past 50 years, and I should probably say mostly in Canada as well. We've been engaged by established writers of poetry and fiction: Rudy Wiebe, Patrick Friesen, Julia Kasdorf, David Bergen, David Waltner Taves, and we've heard from established and emerging critics, Magdalene Redekop and Rob Zacharias. And tonight we'll hear from an emerging writer of fiction, Darcie Friesen Hossack, whose first collection of short stories, Mennonites Don't Dance, has received considerable positive critical attention. But first, I'd like to tell you about next week, week 9, the closing week of this series. Our guests will be a seasoned critic of the writing of Mennonites, Paul Thiessen, whom I know rather well, and a young writer of fiction, Carrie Snyder. In a tribute volume I edited in celebration of the 40th anniversary of the publication of Rudy Wiebe's first novel, Peace Shall Destroy Many, Paul Thiessen, one of some 50 contributors to this volume of tributes to Wiebe, wrote, and I quote, and this will be a quote of a few sentences: "By the time we graduated from our Mennonite high school in Ontario in the spring of 1962, my friends and I, who had grown up in Mennonite churches, had come to know a seemingly undisturbed line of peaceableness that the 50s had encouraged in us. But most of us still had not figured out much about how we might be Mennonite both in the church and in the world. That fall, when the Cuban Missile Crisis hung in our minds, Rudy Wiebe's first novel, frightening, unnerving, seductive, landed in our midst. Here we found some Mennonite guy from the West using written words to thrill and terrify us, with vistas that the 50s had not let us see. As startling for me as Wiebe's breathtaking work were 3 other words that pushed themselves to the fore of my consciousness: McClelland and Stewart. They seemed to show that here was a Mennonite who had found his way into the world. With peace, Rudy pushed us into the 60s, even before they had a chance to arrive with some appropriate ceremony. And from that day on, Wiebe has led the way, helping us to figure out how we might live, even before we knew what to brace ourselves for. And he has made such wonderful mischief along the way." End quote. Paul Thiessen, Professor Emeritus from Wilfrid Laurier University, has been thinking and writing about Mennonite literature for several decades. Along with his substantial and wide-ranging work in British modernism, especially the life and work of the novelist Malcolm Lowry, he has maintained and nurtured his enormous interest in the literary and artistic achievements of the Mennonites in Canada and the USA. He's published widely on the work of Rudy Wiebe, Dallas Wiebe, Sandra Birdsall, and Miriam Taves, among others. His lecture next week will draw on his decades of work on the literature of the Mennonites, focusing primarily on the trouble with Mennonite novels over these 50 years, from Rudy Wiebe to Miriam Taves. And he has warned me to not think he's going to deal with anybody other than Miriam Taves and Rudy Wiebe, but he might mention a few people along the way. This last event of the series next week will begin with a reading from Carrie Snyder, a young writer whose second collection of fiction, The Juliet Stories, was released by the House of Anansi last month. Carrie, whose first book, Hair Hat, 2004, was nominated for the Danuta Gleed Award for Short Fiction, the same award that our visitor tonight, Darcie Friesen Hossack, was recently shortlisted for, is reading at Harbourfront Centre in Toronto as I speak. That is, Carrie is. The protagonist of her book is Juliet Friesen, who is 10 when the fiction begins. It's 1984, and she and her peace activist family have moved to Nicaragua at the height of that country's post-revolutionary war. I've always thought of Carrie Snyder as possibly the most insightful student I've encountered throughout my career. Her work shines with insight, sensitivity, and skill. So what better choice for a last literary guest than this prodigiously talented young woman? So I hope you'll join us tonight. Tonight we'll hear from another emerging writer of fiction, Darcie Friesen Hossack, who's come to Waterloo from Kelowna, British Columbia. We are grateful once more to the Canada Council for the Arts for making possible her performance here tonight. Darcie's first collection of short stories, Mennonites Don't Dance, has been shortlisted for a number of literary prizes, including the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for First Fiction, Canada and the Caribbean, the Danuta Gleed Literary Award, administered by the Writers' Union of Canada, for the best first collection of published short fiction in English in Canada, and the Ontario Library Association Evergreen Award, which honors the best in Canadian fiction and nonfiction titles. Mennonites Don't Dance, published by Thistledown Press in Saskatoon, was also cited by Jim Bartley of the Globe and Mail as among the best first fiction of 2011. One reviewer of Mennonites Don't Dance asks, "What makes these stories Mennonite?" and then offers a reply. Food and stern spirituality play front and center. Rallkuchen and borscht are matched with penance and prayer. Another reviewer offers an alert. If you are an ethnic Russian Mennonite from Canada, don't read this book on an empty stomach. You will be craving Plumamaus, Rallkuchen, and Varenice. It is no surprise to the reader, then, to hear that Darcie has, for several years, been the food columnist for newspapers in Kelowna and Kamloops. When I was a young girl growing up in Mennonite country, she's written, I visited my grandparents on their farm nearly every weekend. I was a city-ish girl. Nothing on the farm ever stopped being a novelty. What I remember most, even more than the barns and outbuildings, the cats and grasshoppers, is my grandmother's cooking. Mennonite to the core, her traditional recipes are ones I return to again and again to remember what it felt like to go home. While Darcie, who grew up with her mother and sister in Swift Current, Saskatchewan, wasn't raised strictly Mennonite, regular visits to her maternal grandparents' farm gave her a window into the Mennonite world. Until she stumbled upon Miriam Taves' A Complicated Kindness, she recalls, she had never thought there was anything to say about growing up on the prairies or having a Mennonite family or about grasshoppers or fighting over chicken feet for lunch or some of the harrowing things that happen in large farming families. Miriam Taves' work made her think otherwise, as she imagined looking at her heritage through someone else's eyes. Hossack's writing may remind readers of Manitoba-born Mennonite authors Patrick Friesen and Miriam Taves is the reviewer for the Winnipeg Free Press. Like The Shunning and A Complicated Kindness, the stories here illuminate the sad reality that not all Mennonite religion and culture is healthy, and no family is easy. Darcie Friesen Hossack is a graduate of the Humber School for Writers, where she was mentored by Sandra Birdsall. In Mennonite Don't Dance, she explores how families work and don't work. Reviewers of the volume speak of how these stories convey, as Birdsall says, the silence between people that speaks of betrayal, forgiveness, and the power of love to prevail. Andrea Schrader speaks of the stories as uncompromising and often devastating, with moments of joy and insight. Another reviewer speaks of Black humor and compassion, of narratives that are at once cruel and rich in moments of grace. Still another observes that there is a near-hidden shining to the characters in the book. Mixed in with their frailties are love of family, prayer, thankfulness, generosity, faith, and the ability to forgive even the ugliest actions. Darcie's work is representative of a force in Mennonite writing in Canada which we've not addressed. The writers of the West Coast, who emerged palpably in 2005 in a special issue of Rhubarb, a magazine of new Mennonite art and writing, published by the Mennonite Literary Society in Winnipeg, and in this instance, guest edited by poets Elsie K. Neufeld, Robert Martins, and Leonard Neufeld. Mennonite writers of the West Coast were featured the next year, in 2006, in an anthology of West Coast Mennonite writing entitled Half in the Sun, published by Vancouver's Ronsdale Press. The fact that the Mennonite writers of the West Coast were not presented as a collective until the mid-90s should not suggest that the writers represented in these collections were all new to writing. Far from it. These West Coast collections include numerous writers of poetry and fiction and nonfiction who've been publishing for years, including Patrick Friesen, Leonard Neufeld, and Andreas Schrader, along with younger generation Elsie K. Neufeld, Carla Funk, Barbara Nickel, Jeff Dirksen, Connie Brown, and of course, Darcie Friesen Hossack. I wish I had time to introduce you to the Fraser Valley poetry of Leonard Neufeld, for example, or to Andreas Schrader's recent novel, Renovating Heaven, published by Ulicon Books in 2008, which has been praised for its wonderful, at once joyous and sardonic treatment of immigrant Mennonite family life. Andreas Schroeder, who, like several others of these West Coast writers, was nurtured in a community of 1940s Mennonite immigrants to Canada, like Winnipeg-born Vern Thiessen, who is presently Canada's most widely produced playwright. Some of you will know his work, Einstein's Gift or Vimy. But those are other stories. I digress. But I wanted you to know that although Darcie comes from way out west, she's not alone as a Mennonite writer out there. I won't say more. Now, Darcie's going to talk about her life and work and how they inform each other, and she'll read from both her published stories and her novel in progress. Afterwards, she'll take questions from the audience, and she has copies of that first story collection to sell. I'm delighted to introduce her to you, and you to her. Darcie, please.
Thank you so much. Several months ago, when Hildy first asked me to step up to this stage, I knew I had to say yes before taking any time to think about today, when I'd actually stand here in my size 7 shoes in the footsteps of giants, the floor still warm from the feet of a Giller Prize winner. If I thought about it right now, I can tell you that the marrow in my bones would wobble like the jelly salad at a Mennonite potluck, and one of you would have to scurry up here with a handful of paper napkins and scoop me up. Listening to Hildy's introduction just now, I kept trying to spot this Darcie Friesen Hossack she was talking about. I have a copy of her book, you see, and would like to point out some typos. There's the ones on page 80 in the story Little Lamb, where 2 words are repeated in the middle of a line and not for effect, and it happens again in another story. And on page 88 in Mennonites Don't Dance, which is the title story, the word door is used 3 times in the space of just 1 1/4 paragraphs. I've also heard a few other things I think you should all know about this so-called Friesen. Like that she pulled up her Mennonite roots when she was 13 years old, and spent more than a decade as a Seventh-day Adventist. Or that she didn't know the name of a single Mennonite author until she was 30 years old. And more, she's Mennonite on her mother's side only, and is therefore not really entitled to the name Friesen. All I can say is that she's very lucky that her readers and the literary press especially have been very forgiving. For the last month, while preparing what I wanted to say here tonight, I did dare to peek at the online videos of this reading and lecture series. And it was Patrick Friesen who unknowingly sent a snipping of courage in my direction when he said that he and just about every other Mennonite author in the Western world has at one time or another slept in Hildy and Paul's guest room. Well, I thought, sharing a mattress must make us some kind of kin. And if I can manage to fall asleep, which I did, in a bed with some very illustrious dust mites indeed, maybe I'll wake up and not think I'm still dreaming. As a wannabe author, which I was until about 10 minutes ago and will be again in about an hour, I learned to have expansive dreams but keep them in an airtight box, to write as though it matters but expect no one will notice. So to be noticed by Hildy then, who spent a career ensuring that the brightest voices of an entire tradition have been heard in a crowded room, is one of the greatest unlooked-for blessings I never saw coming. So before I get to Mennonites Don't Dance, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you, Hildy and Paul, for bringing me here, giving me a home while away from home, and for allowing me to speak to all of these people who've come to celebrate your amazing work. Thank you for allowing me to sleep where great writers have slept, and for gathering me under your umbrella. I've been hiding this from you all day. I'm sneaky. 14 years ago, the first time I decided to write a book that I'm willing to admit to, I was told that to write well, I would have to write what I know. So naturally, being the granddaughter of Dutch Mennonites and having traveled as far east as Winnipeg, I did the sensible thing and I began a novel about India. My thought was that I could learn something I didn't previously know and therefore avoid writing about the prairies, grasshoppers, hard winters, things fried in lard, and other subjects no one surely wanted to read about anyway. If I learned something new, I also wouldn't have to meddle with stories and themes that would later shock and annoy my family, whether Mennonite or when I yoke them together with the other side of my family for the book I'm writing next, the Seventh-day Adventists. So there I was, writing about India, a place I've only ever seen on the Discovery Channel. And after 3 years of hoarding more than 100 library books, I did know a little more than I had before. I even had 400 pages of writing that I proudly referred to as a novel. After a few more years, what I had was a file filled with rejection letters from publishers, and a strong sense that no more postage stamps should be licked and sticked for the sake of a story I no longer believed in. I placed that novel in a box and wrapped that box with duct tape. In the meantime, however, I'd begun to work on a few short stories, and it seemed that no matter what I did, they insisted on becoming Mennonite. Mennonite, and if I'm being honest, also Seventh-day Adventist, although at the time I didn't feel I had a strong enough wooden spoon to stir two such very big pots at the same time. So where the different beliefs share a few square feet of common ground, I folded them together, believing the Mennonite community was the more likely to forgive me. As it's turned out, so many readers have been gracious and supportive beyond my hopes. Others wonder why I can't perhaps write nice stories that give people a laugh. And still others would rather I didn't tell people where I'm from. Stories, though, when their silence has had the power to send shockwaves through generations, must finally be told by someone who has felt the past give shape to the present. In the story Magpie, Magda doesn't understand how a tragedy from her mother's childhood is shaping her own young life. She simply knows that her father is gone, her mother came unglued, and she herself has spent the last 3 years wondering why she got dropped off on her grandparents' farmhouse doorstep after a fight over frozen yogurt. This is from Magpie. All day at school, Magda had thought about the news. It crawled around in the front of her mind, twitched and ate away at her concentration, distracting her from the problems on the chalkboard, caused her to stare at her hands when she should have been thinking about math, current events, and whether to trade her ham sandwich for Karen Neufeld's egg salad at lunchtime. At 3 o'clock, Mr. Taves, her 7th grade English teacher at the Wymark School, to which she and other village kids were bused, had called her up to his desk after class to ask if something was wrong. She scowled and lied, saying that everything was just peachy. Thanks. Now, standing at the edge of a lane of trees that leads to her grandparents' farm, Magda looks through a screen of leaves at her mother's car. The last time she saw it, or her mother for that matter, was 3 years ago after Magda's father split and her mother brought her here. Since then, the home where her mother grew up has been Magda's, where she's done her best to forget she ever had parents. Magda feels like stomping in the front door and announcing to her mother that she isn't a sack of laundry. Normal people don't dump off a daughter and expect her to be fluffed and ready whenever they feel like coming back. Yet she can't bring herself to go inside. When Magda sees her grandfather come out of the house, shield his eyes from the sun with his hand, and squint in her direction, her heart floats into her throat. She swallows it back down and slips round to the other side of the house where there's a carpet of tall grass next to a wooden double bench swing that her grandfather built for her. She holds her breath and wades in as grasshoppers, hiding in the green coolness, lift up a collective alarmed rustle with their scabby wings. The sound would have stopped her once, but not since she was 9 years old in Calgary, when her father had figured out that she was afraid of them. After that, he took her into their backyard every day and caught the fattest one he could find, making her hold it in her hand until she could stop crying, stop squirming, and finally sit still while the huge insect stared up at her from her palm, daring her, it seemed, to flinch. "Count as high as you need to," her father would say when they were having one of their grasshopper sessions, "but soon you shouldn't need to go higher than 3. Even at the time, Magda knew her father's lessons were meant to toughen her so she wouldn't grow up to be like her mother, who he said was about as resilient as a bowl of pudding. Her father was more like the spoon, always stirring up the gunk on the bottom. "I don't know about you, Lizzie," he'd say to Magda's mother when she went to pieces over some small thing, spilled milk. "You'd think, with what happened to your brother all those years ago, you'd have grown a thicker skin." Her mother would come unglued then. Later, she'd try hard to put herself back together, and she'd be better for a while. At the time, Magda didn't know exactly what had happened to her mother's brother, just that it was also why her mother never wanted them to visit the farm in Saskatchewan. Anywhere in Mennonite country was off limits, so Magda's grandparents had always come to Calgary for visits. "There are ghosts back there," her mother said when Magda was still a little girl and asked why. "Real ones?" Magda said, her eyes wide. "Of course not. We're still Mennonite, you and me. We don't believe in ridiculous things." Still, when Magda first arrived on her grandparents' farm, she was afraid of what she might find, even when the only thing was the grasshoppers. Now, 3 years later, when they pop up like mustard seeds splashed into hot oil, Magda screws up her nerve and crouches down among them. She cups her hand over a fat yellow insect and carefully unfolds it into the cage of her fingers. She can feel it scrabbling against her skin, probing for a way out. She buries her face into the shelf of her knees and begins to count. 1, 2, 3. By now, Magda knows her grandmother will have felt the need to call the school bus driver, who would have told her that Magda was dropped off at the corner of the Weebs farm down the road, along with all the other village kids, just like every day. Her grandparents and mother will know that she's nearby. After all, it's not as though she could hook up with a stranger and hitch a ride into town. There are no strangers here. And no one they know would give her a lift without dropping by and checking with her grandparents first. And that's the other problem. There's nowhere else Magda wants to be. Above Magda, who's still holding the grasshopper as it probes against her skin, a canopy of fluttering leaves filters the afternoon sun. She relaxes a little under their shelter. 32, 33, 34. It's been said that my stories are grim. They're dark, there's little humor to be found, and I suppose this is what leads readers to ask whether I have any good memories of being Mennonite and why I didn't draw on them instead. In fact, I've made treasures of some wonderful memories, and I hope they show up in these stories as moments of grace, like when Magda's grandfather keeps watch over his favorite girl, or in the title story when a mother rubs dough from her adult daughter's fingers with a little flour. If there is grace to be found in this book, it's because I have received it. I remember being sick with the flu while spending the night with my grandparents in Schoenfeld, Saskatchewan. I was still young enough that I was sleeping in a crib they'd set up in the living room, and all through that night, my grandmother lay across from me on the Chesterfield, her hand reaching through the crib's spindles where it rested on my forehead until my fever broke in the morning. I remember the night my grandfather put on his hat and coat and drove all the way into the city because I'd forgotten my pink blanket in the dryer that morning and would have to cry myself to sleep that night without it. I remember him making a swing to hang over the rafters in his workshop so I could spend time with him while he cobbled together bits of wood. Because of my Grandma Friesen, I know when bread has been kneaded enough, when a pot of cream gravy is ready by the way it coats the back of a wooden spoon. And because of my Grandpa Friesen, I know that scripture being spoken in Low German sounds like music. I also know what it is to pretend that I have joy down in my heart, when hidden there are sorrows that remain invisible to eyes that believe it's better not to see. John Lent, a poet and a fellow Thistledown author, and one of the first writers I ever met in person, said that writing fiction is taking a grain of truth and then lying like crazy. This, of course, for the purpose of telling a greater truth. So, with the Indian novel put aside, I began to write what I knew. I lied to tell the truth, and all the time wondered who besides me might want to read short stories when no one reads short stories anymore. Written by a once small-town girl about an obscure group of conservative Christians who believe that farming is next to godliness and fight over who gets to eat the chicken's feet at lunchtime. I wrote about prairies and grasshoppers, hard winters, things fried in lard, and other subjects no one surely wanted to read about anyway. And I wrote Pornelope, a story of how a woman's suicide, years later, still affects her daughter and the granddaughter she never knew. This is from Pornelope. The last time I saw my mother alive was early last December. I drove all night, blowing snow, making the usual 2-hour trip from Regina, a wheel-gripping 4, until I finally pulled up in front of the house near midnight. As always, my father had left the porch light on for me and was dozing in a living room chair when I let myself in. It was an old habit of his, this waiting up for me. Mom couldn't go to sleep if she thought there might be a knock at the door in the middle of the night. With Dad keeping watch, if I didn't come home and was discovered lying in a ditch somewhere, he'd be the one to meet the police at the front door. He could break the bad news to Mom, gently, after breakfast. Hi, honey. Rough trip? Dad had yawned and stood up when I came in and shoved the front door shut hard against a gust of wind and snow in an ill-fitted frame. I stomped my boots, snow slagging away from them to melt on the rubber mat that filled the entryway. Not worse than usual, I said. We both knew it was a lie, the kind we always told if Mum was in the room, even when she had still been lucid. How is she? My mother had been diagnosed with dementia a year earlier, and ever since we had watched her give into it as though she were crawling under a warm blanket for a long and needed sleep. I think she's still awake. Why don't you go on up and check on her before you head in? Abandoning my suitcase, I flapped my arms out of my winter parka and headed up the stairs, padding softly over the hallway floorboards without causing a noise. Mom? I said quietly when I reached her half-opened door. I leaned in and found her sitting up in bed, an afghan and lamplight draped across her lap, along with a picture album open to the middle. She was staring off into a corner of the room as though she truly was somewhere else, off wandering through those pictures, perhaps, reimagining our history. Mom, it's me. I just got here. I stepped round to the side of the bed and knelt on the bare floor where that old rag rug used to be. When she didn't acknowledge me at first, I rested my head on the mattress, tired from the trip, tired of pretending I didn't think dementia was just another way for her to keep me at a distance. After a few minutes, I lifted my head when my mother spoke. This was my daughter, she said. Her words came slowly, and she paused, seeming to reach for her next syllable. Tess, she added, with some difficulty, and pointed to the page she'd stopped on. Both sides were covered in a tidy collage of pictures, me as a grass-skirted hula girl in my first figure skating recital, dressed in stiff corduroy slacks and vest for my first day of the 3rd grade, and another of me hugging Socks, our cat. "Mum, that's me," I said, and covered the papery skin of her cool age-modeled hands with mine. Like everything else about her, her hands had aged suddenly, blotting out the woman she used to be. "No," she said, "my daughter died a long time ago, like everyone else." I looked into my mother's face, expecting to find the worry creases she'd always worn between her brows. They weren't there. Her face, after all these years, was more peaceful than I'd ever seen, as though in believing she had really, finally lost those she had always pushed away, seeming to test whether we'd keep coming back, she had found a way to let go. I took the album and closed it lightly, kissed my mother on the cheek, and turned out the lamp. When I went downstairs, Dad was waiting for me in the kitchen with a pot of chamomile tea. "Figured you probably drank a lot of coffee on the way here," he said, and handed me a clunky mug, which I'd always preferred to Mum's dainty china teacups that had been passed down to her from my grandmother. Now, only a few months later, Mum is gone, and I can hardly believe how distant that night seems, that I'm here, alone, following her footsteps into her kitchen. I open the door to her tea cupboard where delicate cups still dangle by their ears from small brass hooks. The hooks were installed because of the trains that sped along the tracks just yards from our back fence. The whole house rattled when the trains passed by, carrying their heavy loads of wheat and potash out of the province, causing the china to tremble to the edge of their shelf. So I suppose it may have seemed deliberate when, a few days after my cat was eaten by coyotes, I opened the cabinet door and one of the teacups fell, breaking in half against the sharp edge of the countertop before tumbling to the floor and shattering. My mother rushed into the kitchen, already wringing her hands. "What did you do?" She grasped my arm with anxious, pinching fingers that would leave a bruise. It fell," I said. "I didn't mean..." It was just there when I opened the door. I tried to catch it. For proof, I held out my hand, which had been cut against a falling shard. "But you didn't catch it." She sucked in a thin, serrated breath before she let go of me and stared at the shelf as though expecting to see the rest of the teacups lined up along the edge, ready to leap down after the first. Tenderly, nervously, she nudged each one to the back of the cupboard, counting as she touched their rims. With one gone, the remaining ones could no longer be called a set. She knelt and with shaking hands began to pick up the pieces of broken pottery into her apron. "From now on, you don't touch these," she said. She glanced at the blood that was dripping slowly from my fingers. I thought she'd offer a Band-Aid, but she only cradled the broken cup in her lap, fitting a few pieces together as though it might miraculously be made whole again if it was all accounted for and fault assigned. "We could try to glue it," I said, tucking my hand behind me. My mother was quiet for a moment. "And do what with it?" Tea would dribble into my lap. "It's in 100 pieces. No, it's broken and that's that." She stood up, found a small box in a drawer, arranged the shards inside, and placed the box on the shelf with the rest of the cups. While I swept up what remained, dust and slivers, Mum went upstairs to lay a cold cloth over her eyes. She disappeared into her bedroom, drew the blinds, and didn't come back downstairs until I'd left for school the next morning. By then, my father had installed the hooks. What, though, people want to know, and are endlessly asking me these days, does it mean to be Mennonite? The question seems so big and the answer so elusive that sometimes the only one I can think to give is that being Mennonite is why I will never ever be skinny. It was my Grandma Friesen, of course, who taught me to cook like a Mennonite. in an impossibly small farm kitchen built onto the side of their farmhouse because the kitchen that came with the house was just for show. We baked sweet. We cooked fatty meats and stuffed pockets of dough with cottage cheese or Saskatoon berries and sugar for vareniki. We made pluma mousse because fruit is always better cooked in cream. Homemade noodles were covered with cream gravy and Rogers syrup. We ate porky cracklings, and if I spent a morning in the barn with my Grandma would greet us at lunchtime with a platter of lard-fried roll kuchen and spears of sweet watermelon, because a little fresh fruit never hurt anyone. Growing up, I spent most of my weekends at my grandparents' farm, and it may have been because I insisted on naming the livestock that Grandpa always seemed to know I wouldn't one day marry a farmer. Once those chickens had had their heads lopped off, though, I did love helping to pluck and reach inside those freshly killed birds to pull out warm gizzards and half-formed eggs. Or when it was time to slaughter pigs and I'd bring a snout to my city school the next day for show and tell. I am Mennonite, and I am a prodigal daughter. Before I turned 14, I left Saskatchewan, my grandparents, and my mother, and in Alberta became my father's daughter, a Sabbath-keeping Seventh-day Adventist vegetarian eating peanut butter and onion loaf, fried gluten steaks, and mayonnaise and banana sandwiches. At the time, I didn't know to think of this as culture shock. I simply knew I had to keep moving in order to keep from thinking. From Alberta, we moved to British Columbia, where I finished high school, worked at a lumberyard, started university, got married, worked in a pancake house, dropped out of university, worked 2 jobs in retail and reception to put my husband through cooking school. I wrote a bad novel about India, began to freelance, established myself as a food writer, wrote some Mennonite short stories, published one, won a minor award with another, published a third, and finally discovered I was still Mennonite and wasn't alone in not understanding what that meant. It was Miriam Tave's novel, A Complicated Kindness, with its bewildered teenage girl trapped in Manitoba, Mennonite country, that began to peel back my own pages. Although I despaired a little at how high the literary bar had already been set, I began these first 10 years of reaching. And during this time, I dared to believe that if I had been dragged to an unlicensed chiropractor to have my spine manipulated by a 100-year-old woman who'd gotten her start on chickens before moving up to sheep and people, others might be able to relate. Doors began to appear, and one opened, of course, when poet and memoirist Elsie Neufeld accepted Ashes for publication in Half in the Sun, an anthology of writing by West Coast Mennonites. They included Andreas Schroeder, whose writing I was also discovering for the first time. I thought I was finally getting somewhere. And then, as still happens right about the time I think I've learned something about writing, I discovered that I am and always will be dust. In 2005, I sent a query in my first few stories to Thistledown Press, a literary house in Saskatoon, and they surprised me by asking to see an entire manuscript. After those first stories, though, something had gone terribly wrong. I'd begun to drag emotional baggage across the page, dropping socks and underwear as I went. If I'd ever known before, I had forgotten how to write. Thistledown's subsequent rejection letter, which arrived within the month, simply and graciously said, "These stories are not yet ready for a literary audience." I needed help. And while I probably should have started with a 101 course on beginnings, middles, and endings, I gravitated like any good Mennonite to a trial by fire. College dropout though I was, I applied to the post-grad mentorship program through the Humber School for Writers in Toronto, a correspondence course that would allow me to slowly lose my mind in the comfort of my own home. For whatever reason, Humber's advisory board took a chance, waived their own admissions requirements of a bachelor's degree, and paired me with Sandra Birdsall, whose Giller finalist novel, The Rustlander, would become the book I read whenever I need to feel completely inadequate as a writer. Now, given that tonight's theme seems to be my great ignorance, it shouldn't surprise anyone to know that until I had to choose which of Humber's instructors I'd like to work with, I had not yet heard of Sandra Birdsall. By the time I wrote down her name, though, I had read every book of hers I could find and can promise you that I'd acquired the proper amount of fear and trembling. I was so afraid, in fact, that I listed her as my second choice. The advisory board, it seems, saw through me, and Mennonites Don't Dance became a book during that year with Sandra. Some stories went in the shredder. Others were stripped back to their titles more than once, after Sandra, as gently as was possible, might say of them, "Well, Darcie, it's clear that you tried very hard." Among my fellow correspondence students who faithfully spatulaed me off the floor, this became known as being birdzled. There were days when I forgot to rinse the conditioner out of my hair, or my husband would come home to find me rocking and humming on the couch, after which he'd take me for a long drive until I'd recovered my wits enough to start over. Eventually, Sandra taught me to get out of my own way and just write. And so I wrote a story about a young boy who, as he grows up, struggles to undo the sins of his father. I knew something was finally going right when Sandra's critique arrived in the mail and she said, "I have been wrapped in my mother's Afghan and reading Luna non-stop and thinking what a fine story this can be." This is from Luna, and we're joining Jonah after his favorite uncle has died. The morning after the funeral, an hour before the sun was up, Jonah woke to a single sharp blow to his bedroom door. He sat up straight and threw off his blanket. "Let's go," his father said, striking the door hard a second time. Without opening it to ask where or why, Jonah piled on his clothes. He hurried outside and picked up a heavy metal box of tools that his father pointed to, lying on the frost-covered path in front of the house. They walked, crunching over gravel and snow, Jonah behind by a few steps as he struggled with the awkward weight of his burden and shifted it from hand to hand. "Too much for you?" Jonah's father said without looking back. It felt like an accusation, but Jonah reasoned that his father just needed time to come to terms with his loss. Before, when something had caused him to fall into one of his moods, he always struggled back to the surface for a while. "No, I'm fine," Jonah said, though his fingers were stiff and his lungs felt brittle with cold, making him desperate to stop and indulge in a fit of coughing. "Good, because tomorrow you can get up early and do your chores before we go. Had to do the milking myself this morning." Jonah, to keep from falling farther behind, held his breath and ran to catch up, the toolbox throwing him off balance. He didn't drop back again, and they arrived at the Martins' farm just as the sun was beginning to show. Mr. Martins was coming out of the house with a slop pail full of plate scrapings, grapefruit peels, and eggshells for his pigs. He stopped and considered Jonah and his father. "Can't say I know what's brought you here, Abram," he said. He gently set down the pail and the wire handle fell and chimed against the side. It felt to Jonah like an invitation to do the same, to put the toolbox by his feet, but he didn't think he could let go. His fingers were stiff as though they had frozen around the handle. "Come to do a bit of unfinished business is all," Jonah's father said after a few moments, which, to Jonah, seemed eternal. "Not your responsibility as I see it, but you're welcome to the work if it's what you want." Mr. Martins looked from Jonah's father to Jonah to the unfinished barn, its undressed frame salted with beads of snow. For a week after that, except on Sunday, Jonah got up and was busy with the milking before his father's feet hit the floor. It was still dark when he finished, and even the cows seemed to know it was too early to protest with their usual fidgeting and swishes of their manure-crusted tails. When he was done, Jonah waited in the barn where it was warm enough to keep from shivering. As soon as he heard his father's boots on the gravel outside, Jonah snatched up the toolbox and was ready to walk. Working together, Jonah and his father finished sooner than they expected, and Jonah felt satisfied to have completed his uncle's work. Pleased, too, that he had done something measurable to help his mother and father. The money from the job would be useful, he was sure. Maybe they'd even celebrate by killing a chicken for supper that night. At the Martins' door, Jonah stepped forward and knocked before retreating to stand just behind his father. Every day after they finished, Mrs. Martins had invited them in to warm up with a cup of coffee, a slice of fresh pie, or a share of whatever baking she had done during the afternoon. Every day, Jonah's father had refused. "I guess we're done here," Jonah's father said when Mrs. Martins opened the door. Jonah could smell fresh bread and imagined eating it with a thick slab of butter and a spoonful of jam. He thought his father must be wrong about her and believed that this time, because they were finished, because she was so kind, his father would accept her invitation. "Come on in," said Mrs. Martins. "Get yourselves out of the cold." She opened the door wider, and warm, yeasty air flowed over Jonah's face, leaving it moist, then colder than before. "No, don't think so. We'll just be on our way." It had happened the same way each day, but Jonah still felt that this time would have to be different. Surely his father wouldn't keep them standing in the cold while Mrs. Martins went inside for their money. "At least come in while I fetch your envelope," she said. Jonah took an involuntary step towards her, but took it back when his father didn't move. "I won't accept that," Jonah's father said. "It's not rightfully mine. It belongs to Elias, and he's not here to take it." He doffed his hat, a grey felt fedora, and turned round, leaving Jonah still looking at Mrs. Martins. He swallowed hard, as though a sharp stone had lodged in his throat. He was unable to tear his eyes from her until she reached back inside the house. Mrs. Martins opened the envelope and pressed a warm dollar into Jonah's hands, squeezing it in both of hers, and closed the door. "Miserable old sow would be sure to remind me and everyone else about her bleedin' barn until kingdom come," Jonah's father said after they were half a mile down the road. "Didn't deserve what we did for them." Jonah nodded as though he understood. A little while later, Jonah's father took the toolbox from him and carried it the rest of the way. But without the weight he'd become accustomed to, it was harder for Jonah to walk straight. "You know that disease of your uncle's runs in families," Jonah's father said as they walked. Ever since Elias died, he'd been unable to speak the disease's name, as though it would invite the cancer in. "Means my number's up next, and you should go ahead and plan to get done what you want to get done long before you're my age. All a man can do is work hard enough and take as little as he needs so that the old bastard upstairs doesn't take notice, then just go on and die as well as you can." That night, Jonah didn't sleep. He sat on his bed, uncomfortably awake, wrapped in a rough quilt that smelled of wet wool from his own cold sweat. He turned over in his mind what his father had said about hard work and reward until he looked at it from all sides, until he believed it. When Jonah finally lay down, he held his breath and stayed as still as he could. Thoughts of stuff going wrong inside him swooped down, veering away at the last second before he was able to catch and reason with them. He began to shiver. It wasn't until morning, when the sun glared past the edges of the heavy brocade drapes over his window, that he thought of looking for an extra dry blanket. Jonah dressed before his parents were up. Although it was a warmer day than those before, Jonah ached from a chill that had seeped under his skin and into his bones. He felt starved, full of holes, but had no appetite. Without breakfast, he completed his morning chores. When finished, he set off to clean the old outhouse, a weather-worn shamble of sticks his mother had lately complained wasn't fit to be used. For an hour, Jonah scrubbed frozen fly specks from the walls and seat, swept up the bodies of insects that had died in the fall, the flies that spun on their backs until they finally succumbed, the moths that had shed the ability to eat along with their soft caterpillar bodies. He poured lye down the toilet hole and could have finished there. It would have been enough. If it were spring, he would have searched in the dark corners and between the boards for spiders, daddy longlegs mostly, even though they ate mosquitoes. He would have crushed them with his thumb, each one popping like a blister. Instead, he whisked away their crumbling webs and brushed them off onto his pants. By the last web, his hands were gloved in grimy spider silk. When he was through, Jonah walked around the outhouse and walked around it again, worrying tracks down to the frozen dirt under the snow. It was still filthy, he thought, disappointed in a way he couldn't understand. He crouched down on his heels, bowed his head under his hands, and cringed at what he felt he needed to do. He thought about the boys his age that he knew were going pond skating that afternoon, maybe playing hockey if there were enough of them. For a moment, he closed his eyes and imagined the ice under his blades, the feeling of freedom. He shook his head, driving away the image. With extra lumber that he and his father had gone back and hauled away after finishing the Martins' barn, Jonah began to work on building a new outhouse. He sawed and hammered wood together into a frame, sawdust and the occasional drop of blood staining the trampled snow under his feet. When the frame was up, he dressed it with plumb horizontal slats. On the inside, he sanded any wood that might be touched when someone visited. He worked without rest, without water, his breath shallow and tight as though sucking air through a paper straw. Finally, he picked up an axe and began to chop a new hole in the frozen ground. When it was deep enough, he pushed and dragged the new outhouse over top. Jonah stood and arched his back, muscles tightly bundled from bending over his work. In the time since he'd started, a storm front had pushed its way down from the north. Jonah could see it gaining on the horizon, feeding the warmer air that had briefly settled over the prairie. And while he knew the storm could shift to the east and leave them be, it was better to put on an extra layer of clothing and be ready for the cold. The last thing Jonah did before the storm came was to go into the old outhouse and throw the $1 Mrs. Martins had given him into the hole. After writing Luna, things that had hidden themselves began to come clear. Characters came to life and grafted themselves into their settings, and by the end of school I had workable drafts of 11 stories that were almost, but still not quite, ready for a literary audience. For several months following, I worked with an editor who was also a classmate, and then took a giant breath and began to submit to publishers again. Over the next 2 years, I sent queries to Thistledown Press again and half a dozen other houses. 3 of them took Mennonites Don't Dance to a final vote of their executive boards before saying no. Critiques included, are there too many stories here about very young people? Or, a few of these are the best stories we've read all year, but we've decided to go with another author. One day, holding a letter that read, I have no doubt you'll be published someday, but not with these stories. I began to wonder whether I should have listened to my grandmother-in-law, who once tried to put a stop to my typing and fit me for a job as her dry cleaner's apprentice. Meanwhile, my manuscript's final rejection arrived in the mail while my now chef husband was overseas in Germany. 8 years had passed since I began these stories, 11 since I began that novel about India. And while it wasn't the first time terrible doubts had knocked at my door, it was the first time I invited them in. My husband sent flowers, while my sister got on a bus and arrived in time to sweep the crumbs of me off the floor. My Humber classmates spread over the entire country, gathered round by email, and were as protective as a circle of buffalo. And then, finally, Thistledown Press, which had been silent for a year after I sent them that unsolicited rewrite, offered to publish Mennonites Don't Dance. It took 2 more years, but the book was released in September 2010, and by October, before a single review had been printed, Mennonites Don't Dance was quietly banned by a public library in a Mennonite community. Looking back, I probably should have taken this as a good omen. At the time, though, I had never felt so far from home. Advice included everything from don't let it get to you to quick, call the CBC and Right to Read Foundation. This could be your ticket. I can tell you that it did get to me, and I didn't make those calls, although I did keep the very book that the library sent back, and it's the one I've been reading from tonight. In time, reviews followed, and short lists, including one for the Commonwealth Prize and the Evergreen Award. My name began to appear alongside Mennonite authors who had, although shamefully recently, become my heroes. Last May, the Writers' Union named Mennonites Don't Dance as a runner-up for the Danuta Gleed Award, and although I wasn't able to attend the presentation myself, I was later told that Andreas Schroeder and David Waltner Taves had made it my cheering section and had made a bit of noise. These things and other reactions from the Mennonite literary and scholarly community have been a homecoming of a kind. As was the day I accidentally pocket-dialed Miriam Taves and she agreed to not think of me as a stalker. This is only my second time anywhere in Ontario, but tonight has been a homecoming also, and one of the things I will treasure up in my heart and remember when I again find myself far from home. In the novel, my agent politely asks about every few months. Marie Thiessen-Schiltz is also far from home. A daughter of Mennonite farmers from southwest Saskatchewan, Marie worries about her husband's plan to move their family to a Seventh-day Adventist commune near Vernon, British Columbia. Later, Marie's daughter Lizzie will take over her mother's story, and she'll do it with some spunk. But for now, we find Marie and Simon driving home together on the day that will change all of their lives. This is from the half-finished novel, What Looks In. Since leaving the Silver Hills commune, daylight had become gritty and turned to dusk. The Nova's headlamps spilled pale yellow broth onto the highway, enough that something might come into focus just as it became too late to swerve. A deer, a rock the size of a Chesterfield slipped from an unstable bank, or one of the cheerless, soiled people who seemed for no reason to drift between towns along the shoulder of the road. Or whatever was out there, they might not see it at all. Marie, in the passenger seat next to Simon, tried not to look directly at oncoming logging trucks whose 18 wheels carved into their lane, stealing precious inches and edging them towards the blasted faces of cliffs. She winced at the sound the car's front wheel made as it drove over a lump on the road. Probably it was nothing, just a clod of ice that had shared off a semi's mud flaps after coming through Rogers Pass. But ever since she'd learned about a mother in Ontario who'd placed her infant daughter in a brown paper bag like a head of cabbage and left her on the highway to die, Marie imagined an abandoned infant under every piece of debris. The mother in the story was distraught, utterly alone, or so Marie believed, with only sense enough left to know that a suffering creature should be put out of its misery, even if the misery was her own. Of course, Marie had been horrified at the story. She grieved for the thrown-away child, but secretly felt more for the mother who'd been so desperate and would have to live with what she'd done. To keep from thinking such terrible things, Marie busied herself with crocheting. Even in the near dark, she was self-conscious about her hands, though, which were all meat and knuckles, with circular wrinkles like elephant knees, red and rough from scrubbing pots and potatoes. As the yarn slipped and looped through her fingers, though, making delicate, even knots, she remembered how they had felt the first time Simon had touched them, slender and elegant, piano hands. The half-finished purple scarf draped over Marie's lap was for their daughter. With yarn the color of stewed plums, Lizzie would hate it and complain. Marie nearly hadn't bought the yarn, had several times returned it to the clearance shelf at Zeller's, but in the end she paid the $1 for 2 balls, knowing from experience that it was possible to get used to things one had a natural distaste for, like the way Marie learned to become vegetarian after leaving her parents' home, where they raised and slaughtered their own cows, sheep, pigs, chickens, even ducks, to marry a moral vegetarian. As a Seventh-day Adventist, Simon was convinced he belonged to God's one and true church. He answered to more books than just the Bible, and when the Spirit moved him, took God's law about eating all the way back to the garden. Besides that, Simon was German, which meant that he was doubly right about everything. If he believed something, he would never betray himself by entertaining doubts. Marie's family, Dutch Mennonites with a good measure of Hutterite, also knew how to elevate righteousness to a way of life. Her own grandfather had been among the last of the men of his village to consent to rubber tires for his horse cart, which he'd said provided too much comfort to be of any moral benefit. As Simon pointed out, however, her family still ate pork, drank coffee, and broke the Sabbath by worshipping on Sunday, and Dutch, as everyone knew, was really only a pale copy of German. Marie lowered the scarf into her lap. "I hope we won't be late. Kids might worry," she said, unable to keep the thought tucked in. But with it she'd nicked the taut string of Simon's patient and could see his fingers tighten their grip on the wheel. As always, she could hear words forming in Simon's mouth before he said them. They sounded like stones grinding. "If we're late, it's because of your superstitions, afraid to leave the house if you see your own fat shadow, checking the stove 20 times. As always happened when Simon spoke to her this way, Marie suddenly felt as though she was sitting on a cardboard chair. Shifting nervously, she glanced behind her, anxious for the reassuring city lights they'd recently passed. But Vernon was too far behind them now, and all she saw was the reflection of gray on water. Shuswap, Okanagan, Kalamalka, Duck, Wood. Marie was never sure which lake was which, and not knowing made her lose her sense of north. Having forgotten her yarn in mid-stitch, Marie unraveled the few rows she couldn't account for and turned back to watch the road ahead of them. Earlier in the day, the narrow corridor that led past the town of Lumbee to Silver Hills had been tightly lined with pines like stiff men standing shoulder to shoulder. But now, on the highway at night, as Simon arced around curves and dipped through gullies, the road seemed to slide out from beneath them around every turn. "You're driving too fast," she said, her thoughts crumbling out of her mouth like broken teeth. "I'm glad we're almost home. I think I can even take your speeding if it gets me farther away from that place." Without warning, Marie was sucked into her seat. As discreetly as she could, she unlooped the yarn from around her fingers and slid her hands under her thighs. With skin rough and red from washing with powdered dish soap, her hands rasped against her polyester casing. She ached deep in the jelly of her bones to be someplace else, disappear entirely if she could. Instead, the car lurched over a sudden frost heave. Landing, she felt the full weight of her body as though the car had taken her measure, the spongy hips and legs that were all her mother's, sturdy calves and ankles that she had allowed to become bristly, thighs white and soft as suet, and a dough-like lump of belly that had never flattened after having Lizzie and stretched irrevocably to become like rotted elastic after Zach. Since then, even Marie's hair, which she had been secretly proud of when it was long and pale and hung down her back in an even braid, had thinned and turned dull. Not light brown or dark blonde or even gray, but a shade that reminded her of the mice that got stuck in the glue traps she set inside their kitchen cupboards. And because it was winter, her hair was also dry. It crackled around her ears with electricity and hung to the middle of her neck, unstyled and unlovely. Simon continued to accelerate and Marie began to hum, a squeak of a sound barely audible over the car's engine. It seeped out of her until it flattened into a hymn her mother had taught her to sing whenever she felt far from home. "Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer, my God." The melody was thin and thready, like a bow dragged across the strings of a cheap violin. "For crying out loud, Marie," Simon said. "You'd think I was trying to kill us." He slammed his hand against the steering wheel and Marie's face fell towards her lap. Her cheeks and ears burned until she imagined they must be glowing. Then, unexpectedly, Simon eased his foot back. As they slowed, he reached over and squeezed Marie's knee, startling her. He relaxed his shoulders and attempted a smile, but his mouth was a shadowy fissure in the hard lines of his face. "I don't know if God's going to want you up there if you sing like that. The angels will kick you out of the choir." Marie freed one hand from beneath her and placed it next to his. She took a breath and held it until it felt stale. Finally, she used it to say what she'd been holding in all day. I just don't see how we could live at that place. Do you? Surely we can do just as well for Lizzie and Zach in our own home. I'm not sure you saw, but those children there, they must feed them nothing but carrots. The whites of their eyes were orange. Even their skin looked orange. That can't be healthy, can it? Simon took back his hand and flexed his fingers as though they had suddenly become stiff. He pushed air out through his nose, a sound like sandpaper scraped across wet wood, raising splinters on Marie's skin. And I suppose you'd have them raised on pork and potatoes, he said. I didn't say that, but you think it. After all this time, knowing better, you'd still go back, lard your white bread every morning and never think twice of it. And you wonder why I won't have you take the kids to see your family. They need to be raised around people who have some sense. Lizzie and Zach might want to know where they came from someday. They are half Mennonite. The only thing they need to know is where they're going, Simon said, the car beginning again to pick up speed. By now, dusk had faded to black and the lake was inky with darkness, the road a dark and winding tunnel. Simon? Enough, he said. He plunged the gas pedal to the floor as though crushing a rodent beneath his foot and turned to face her. Simon, please watch the road, she said. Simon! But his eyes on her were like a weight pressing down. Why do you do this? Marie closed her eyes and felt Simon's gaze break away from her. Her shoulders shuddered. She leaned forward against her seatbelt, which accepted her weight like a restraining arm. A moment later, the car was snatched sideways and Marie's body went loose with the sensation of flight. But instead of a cushion of air in front of the car, there was only stone. At the last second, Marie threw out her arms in front of her and her hands absorbed the Nova's dashboard the moment the car struck an escarpment of rock that protruded too far into a turn. The front of the car crumpled like foil before spinning flatly. The mountains unspooled and Marie saw them as a black and white film, frame by frame. There was sudden, shocking stillness and cold. Until that moment, it hadn't occurred to Marie to think of the lakes themselves as a danger, but now freezing water filled the car, lifting her legs, which she instinctively pushed back down with her hands that now felt like bags of broken sticks, until her feet found the floor. Marie didn't cry for help. She felt separate from what was happening, until panic rose as an acid taste in her throat, and she grappled for her seatbelt. Those things will just kill you slower, Simon had warned her 1,000 times, though he always allowed her to buckle in the kids and slung his own shoulder into the strap whenever he spotted a police car. But there was no police car here, and Simon, when Marie turned to look for him, was gone. Submerged up to her waist, her chest, her shoulders, as the water measured her inch by inch, Marie's thoughts reached towards Lizzie and Zach at home with the babysitter. Without Marie, there would be nothing to stop Simon from moving them to Silver Hills and raising them on carrots. Of the children they'd met that morning, not one of them had taken the hard candy raspberries Marie offered from her purse. They'd simply lifted their shoulders and let them drop. "No, thank you," they'd recited, as though she'd offered them each an onion. Thank you for listening.
Darcie's prepared to engage questions or comments if anybody has some. Yes.
You mentioned, I think, short-term memory, you had to get away from yourself. Was that the expression you used? All right. You didn't say you had to get over yourself, but did you get away from yourself?
Was it in the context of being in school with Sandra and her teaching me to, how did I put it? I think it's get over myself, stop thinking so much. To get out of my own way and just write.
How do you do that?
Well, perhaps it will help to tell you about when Sandra's packages would come in the mail. The way we had it set up, I would email her drafts of stories. She would print them and she would mark them by hand, put them in the mail and send them back. And I had some idea of when they might arrive because we had a bit of a schedule going. And I'd go down to my mailbox and I'd open the door and I would see her manila envelope and I would start to shake. And I lived in a condo at the time, so I had to carry it down the hallway, up the stairs, down the hallway again and inside, and I would get down on my knees and open it up and pull out her pages and find out that I had not done well at all. And in fact was failing the course until about the middle. And I wrote to her despairing, saying I don't know what to do. I'm doing everything I know how to do, and I no longer understand how to put a story together. I've forgotten. And that started a series of emails between us. And I was glad that it was emails and not a phone conversation, because I could go back and refer to them. But basically she would tell me to stop thinking so much, stop wanting it so much, stop trying so hard, stop taking it so seriously and let it take it seriously itself. She told me to be more like an investigative journalist, asking who, where, what, when, and why, and reminding me that stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that they don't, like I said, just meander along the page, dragging emotional baggage and dropping it here and there. And and finally, it was like a curtain drawing back, and suddenly it didn't seem simple, but it seemed possible. So I would begin at a beginning, and I would work towards a middle, and then I would work towards the end. And what do you know? That made a story. At the back.
Was the Saskatchewan grasshoppers not the thick brown stuff in the holding in your hand?
They never did it to me. And I was terrified of them growing up, and still am now. My husband will tell you, even in Kelowna, where we have grasshoppers that are this big, and they're green and cute, they almost look like little cartoon characters, I will cross the street, find one there, and then cross the street again to avoid them both. But the ones in Saskatchewan, I remember my father picking them up, and he would dissect them, and I don't remember them spitting anything. I remember them splurting things from the inside once their heads were off, but I don't remember grasshopper vomit, but I'll be sure to use that in a story.
Very polite.
There's a question here.
I'm curious, your experience writing short stories now versus writing a novel. Is there anything that you particularly enjoy about one versus the other? Or even, I'm thinking too, in a Mennonite context, we're used to little anecdotes.
Mm-hmm. One day I had an idea for a story, and I sat down and I wrote it until it was done, and it was short. And I thought of another one, and I sat down and I wrote it until it was done, and it was short, and found myself writing a collection of short stories. And once the stories were done and ready for publishing, I sat down one day to write a story and tried to write until it was finished, and one day realized, oh no, this thing is a novel. And I was horrified. I called up a friend who's also a writer, and I said, Susan, it's a novel. It's a novel. And she said, I'm sorry. On the other hand, I've heard it said, How does it go? Why do you write short stories? Why do you write a novel? Because I don't have time to write short stories. And with short stories, everything needs to be so condensed and so compact and so to the point, whereas a novel just, gives you more room to spread out and look around and have more characters. And with the stories, I'll try to limit it to 2 characters, sometimes 1, but with a novel, I'm enjoying getting to know an entire family. There.
There was ever a Seventh-day Adventist Writers Conference. Would you accept?
I might be the only one there.
Well, I think what I wanted to lead to was most of your commentary on Mennonite life, despite what you said earlier, seems to lose a lot of love and respect, whereas most of your other comments on their side, I didn't notice much love or respect.
Well, it might answer your question to know that I'm terrified of publishing this novel. It'll be, the other side of my family will be the ones looking for themselves, and whether or not they're there, and they are and they aren't there, they'll focus in their microscope more deeply. And I'm afraid of that. And I also, my husband has become a Mennonite, but was a Seventh-day Adventist, and his Seventh-day Adventist pastor, father, married us. So not only have I stolen him away from the one and true church and taken him away from the Sabbath and from vegetarianism, I don't think they're going to be very happy with me, even though they are not in the novel, just some of their very weird food is.
I haven't read your book yet, but I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Can you tell us which library banned your book and why?
It was the Lacrete Library in northern Alberta, and they banned it based on it being blasphemous and having coarse language. I think I used the word shit in the context of manure, and referred to the old bastard upstairs, which is not my opinion, but was certainly the opinion of Jonah's father. And to have taken that out of his mouth would have done a disservice to poor Jonah, to lighten those words. So it was something I really wasn't expecting. Yes?
When I read the book, I had some similar feelings that you said had been critiqued, that there was I almost thought there wasn't a redeeming element for some of the characters. And that sort of got in the way for me. I must say, after having heard you today, I'm going to go back and I'm going to read it with a different eye and a different ear, because you've just given a delightful presentation and more understanding from me now of where you were coming from and why you wrote what you did.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think that's a wonderful place to stop.
Okay.
And I think there are a lot of people here who would agree with Gudrun. And so I do want to remind you that Darcie does have some books here, and she's prepared to sign them for you, and Paul will take care of making change or whatever needs to be done.
And I have bookmarks as well.
And bookmarks
And,
for
and
everybody.
those are complimentary, so please come up and
Right.
and,
Really
and
very handsome.
grab a bookmark or 2 or 3.
So that, put it in your new book. Some wonderful statements by Sandy Bertel and Andrea Schrader, right? And a picture of the front cover of the book, which is very, very handsome. So thank you all for coming. This was just wonderful, just a really beautiful evening for me. I'm sure, well, Gudrun has said it, I think everybody feels that way. So keep Thank you.
Thank you.